There being no objection, leave is granted. Senator Milne.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Mr Deputy President, the budget is the most values-laden of any document tabled in the parliament. It reflects the priorities for the nation and the future. The Treasurer said as much at the beginning of his budget speech yesterday. If you want to know what people and governments value, then follow how they raise and spend their money. The test of this budget is not the size of the deficit or how quickly Treasury forecasts a path back to surplus, but rather whether the decisions underpinning and outlined in the budget make Australia a greater nation, at home and abroad, whether it makes us a more caring, happy and prosperous community, whether it looks after the precious places and plants and animals that we all love, and the natural and built environment in which we grow food and in which we live, and also whether it delivers all this in a fiscally responsible way. What is so disappointing about the budget is that it doesn't present a coherent vision of where the country needs to be in 10 years' time, or of how we face the challenges posed by an increasing global population in a rapidly warming world, the interdependence of economies and our own narrow economic base, as well as our overdependence on resource-based industries and the fossil fuel-intensive energy sector that drives them. We've hollowed out the manufacturing sector, we've failed to invest in education, and we've stuck our heads and future in a hole in the ground. We've done so for decades, and we're planning to keep on doing it. What Australians needed was relief from the pressure they're feeling day to day in keeping a roof over their heads, food on the table, and they needed hope that the anxiety about the future they feel when they hear of job losses, of fees rising, farmers walking off the land, traffic congestion, they want to know that those pressures can be relieved. And people wanted a vision, a glimpse even, of a future in which everyone can be healthy and flourish, with a great education, with job prospects in a dynamic, diversified economy, and live in a safe climate in communities that are safe, sustainable and friendly, and that they can look forward to an old age supported by appropriate health and aged care. The fact that this budget is a finance plan without a broad vision and beset by confusion and contradictions is what makes it, as a budget, fail. And Mr Abbott's alternative is worse, full of rhetoric but devoid of detail, the very magic pudding against which Mr Hockey railed. While championing important and necessary reforms such as disability care and Gonski education funding, the government cannot at the same time aspire to be a low-taxing government. We've got a lower tax-to-GDP ratio than even under the Howard government. You can't claim to be choosing a smarter Australia while cutting funding to research and development, universities and schools and students in order to fund schools. You can't claim to be addressing climate change while stripping millions from renewable energy and continuing to shovel billions of dollars into fossil fuel subsidies. And you can't claim to be choosing a fairer Australia while condemning those who are unemployed to poverty. And I notice that's precisely what Mr Abbott has said he would do, but even worse. In contrast, the Australian Greens have a consistent vision shared by many Australians. We want the gap between rich and poor to be closing, not widening. We want a sustainable environment to future-proof our economy and quality of life. We want infrastructure spending that gives us clean, livable cities. We want farmers to stay on the land. We want investment in research and development, education and innovation to give us the low-carbon economy we need to meet the challenge of global warming. We recognise revenue must be raised, and we want it to come from those who can afford it, mining corporations making billions from resources the people own, and major banks already making record profits. We want Australians to keep their generosity of spirit in the community, both here and abroad, and for Australia to be a respected global citizen. Yet, despite continuing growth, low unemployment and inflation under control, millions of Australians feel uncertain about the future, uncomfortable and under pressure. And the question is, what is the government doing in this budget to relieve that pressure? Labor is not doing enough, and we know from Mr Abbott's speech tonight that a coalition government will make it even worse. The opposition leader gave us no confidence that he will place people over short-term economic outcomes. He says we need a competent, trustworthy adult government. But as one wag said today, he's right. But where will we find one? Certainly not with Whyalla wiped off the map, Gladstone ghost town Mr Abbott, or an alternative Prime Minister who said in his book Battle Lines that the role of other ministers is to pick holes in your argument wherever possible, so he tried to avoid taking things to Cabinet. Sounds very much like direct action. He says he will be honest and competent, but is facing at least a $70 billion black hole, now gaping even further from scrapping the carbon price but keeping the compensation and tax cuts. How on earth is he going to keep an $18,200 tax-free threshold plus all other compensation and pay the polluters as well? This is back to the Costello handout era of corporate welfare on steroids. We are going to see, according to Mr Abbott, a company tax cut as well. What happened to Mr Hockey's end to the age of entitlement? This is dishonest and incompetent, and it will be no surprise when it isn't funded. Without raising more revenue from more taxes, we'll see bigger and more extreme cuts to services, thousands of public servants out of jobs, polluters being paid, and even less support for those in need from Mr Abbott and the coalition. So let's test the claim of a stronger economy that was made by the government in the budget. Well, not so. Instead, we have the absolute failure of the mineral resource rent tax to raise any significant revenue, only $200 million in its first year. This is an embarrassment for Labor, who championed the tax to, quote, spread the benefits of the boom, unquote. Well, $200 million doesn't go very far. If Labor had the backbone to stand up to the big mining corporations, it wouldn't need to slash funding to universities or push single parents into poverty. As John Falzon from St Vincent de Paul has said, the budget is less Robin Hood and more Sheriff of Nottingham. No wonder Tony Abbott intends to support the government's cuts. And let me address the attempts by the Treasurer to explain away the failure of his mining tax. He points to the drop in commodity prices, and it's true, commodity prices have come off their record highs, but they're still at historically high levels. And it's true that the resource rent taxes are on profits, but can the Treasurer explain how Rio Tinto, which made a $9 billion profit from iron ore last year, paid no mining tax? Is the Labor Party really suggesting that a $9 billion profit is not enough to be taxed? The reality is that the mining tax has fundamental design flaws as a result of BHP, Rio and Xstrata running rings around the Treasurer and the willingness of the Prime Minister to cut a political deal at the expense of the community. Labor has shown in this budget its lack of courage, as has Mr Abbott in his budget reply. Unlike Labor and the coalition, the Greens are not afraid to stand up to the big mining corporations in the interests of Australia's people. If the government had the courage to close the loopholes in the mining tax, like they are looking to do for other multinational business arrangements, this could be a nation that invests in education as a whole, rather than cutting from universities and childcare to fund schools. And what about a smarter nation? Education is central to our vision for Australia. The Greens will give children better education from early childhood through school and on to university and TAFE. The government is right to highlight the need for a smarter Australia, but a nation doesn't become smarter by cutting funding to universities and research. Indeed, this is a dumb choice. We're risking our competitiveness in the global economy as well as our capacity to respond to global challenges by raising money from the poorest students and our universities. Now, universities have been vocal about the effects of these cuts on the quality of the education they can provide. And according to a poll by Universities Australia, over 50% of Australians oppose cutting university funding to pay for schools. Australian students are already under pressure, with more than 80% of full-time undergraduates working as well as studying. The changes to the start-up scholarships will place even greater debt burdens on Australia's poorest students. It's a measure that is contrary to the ideal of opportunity for all in education, and it's likely to see a reduction of enrolments from those who are most disadvantaged. That is dumb and mean, and the Australian Greens will move to block the cuts to universities and students. The challenge for the coalition is whether they will work with the Greens to protect our universities, in particular our regional universities, who will be hit very hard by these cuts, and ensure greater opportunities for students, or whether they'll continue this harsh agenda. And according to the Leader of the Opposition tonight, it is to continue the harsh agenda, as he said he will back all of Labor's cuts in this if he happened to get into government. And for all the talk of creating a smarter Australia, this budget, on top of cuts to research and development last year, turns its back on some of the most exciting, innovative projects that are happening in this country and in dire need of support before their funding runs out within a year. The Bionics Institute, whose teams played a key role in the successful development of Australia's world-leading bionic ear over the past 25 years, has a plan to develop 6 new devices in the next 5 years to treat chronic pain, movement and psychiatric disorders. The potential health benefits and market size are bigger than Cochlear's bionic ear. They need only $24 million over 5 years to keep going. Yet, despite requests, there is nothing for them in the budget. Meanwhile, Bionic Vision Australia, a world-leading national consortium of researchers working together to develop a bionic eye, is currently using advanced manufacturing techniques to make in Australia prototypes that right now are being tested in patients. They need a mere $8 million a year for the next 3 years to keep going, but the budget turns its back on them. Without secure funding past this year, researchers will pack up and look to other countries that can offer greater support, and we may lose this work forever, just as we have with so many climate scientists and technologies. News today that CSIRO scientists have developed flexible solar panels that can be printed at home is great, but cutting 165 jobs from that very institution, the CSIRO, is dumb. These are the industries of the future, where Australia's advanced manufacturing techniques and our incredible intellectual capacity work together. If we can sell the world a bionic eye or an implant that relieves pain, it will be far better than shipping off coal or wood chips. The Australian economy is in transition. We must move away from dig it up, cut it down, ship it away. We can prepare for the new economy or be caught out. The old parties seem more than content to leave us to be caught out by the changing global situation and the carbon bubble that will see huge coal projects and ports stranded as black elephants. Cutting more than $1 billion from renewable energy, energy efficiency and the environment is not smart or strong, and further evidence that Labor cannot be trusted on the environment. First, let's be clear. We're in a climate change emergency. Last week, climate scientists reported that for the first time atmospheric CO2 concentration figures exceeded 400 parts per million, moving us perilously close to runaway climate change. In that context, the government has to answer 2 fundamental questions in the budget. First, why do they believe that the measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions should be revenue neutral? The government asserts that receipts from the sale of emission permits should equal expenditure on assistance measures and programs to promote energy efficiency and renewable energy. But why? Given that we're in a climate emergency and deep and sustained emission cuts are a scientific imperative, why should expenditure on climate-related programs be revenue neutral? It's like saying that defence should be revenue neutral in a war. Second, the government said the funding to climate-related programs needed to be cut because of a lower carbon pricing when trading starts. But the trading period doesn't start until 2015-16. So why is the government cutting almost $400 million from the essential Australian Renewable Energy Agency, the effective Low Carbon Communities program and the critical Biodiversity Fund during this 2-year period? Not only is this a breach of the Multi-Party Climate Committee agreement, It's denying Australians cheaper electricity prices through investments in renewable energy. But the opposition is not serious about climate change either, and contrary to his promises about a secure and safe Australia, Mr Abbott is mortgaging our children's future. His direct action plan still hasn't won support from a single Australian economist or industry group. Perhaps Mr Abbott, who wants to be seen as honest, trustworthy, competent, can give a straight answer to the question of the dollars that are going to go into the carbon fund and a yes or no answer as to whether he will maintain the 41,000 gigawatt-hour target for the large-scale RET. The budget is further evidence that the Labor government is internally conflicted about climate change and can't be trusted to protect the environment. The rush for coal seam gas and exporting more and more coal is killing the Great Barrier Reef and destroying valuable farmland and groundwater systems, and Labor and the Coalition are standing by and letting this destruction happen. Not one coal seam gas project has been rejected by Minister Burke. Not smart or strong, that is dumb, weak and dangerous. And so is Mr Abbott's proposed one-stop shop for environmental approvals. Mr Abbott will stand by and let the Queensland government turn cattle into national parks and allow them to graze those national parks, at the same time as standing by and allowing the Queensland government to overturn national parks for logging. And today we had an Abbott opposition talking about agreeing to logging in World Heritage areas. Despite taking the chair of the G20 next year, Australia is failing to live up to the commitment given at the G20 to end fossil fuel subsidies. While we welcome the cutting to carbon capture and storage programs, which was always a nonsense and a waste of money, the government will continue to provide billions in tax breaks for big mining corporations while pushing single parents onto Newstart. While shaving the subsidy for mining exploration, the government's ongoing financial support to the big miners is bad for the climate and a diversion of taxpayer funds that could go into creating a more caring society. These are the choices and priorities of Labor, and they are backed by the opposition. Well, what about fairer? The Greens have a vision not only of closing the gap on ecological sustainability, but also between rich and poor, and that gap has been widening. We support a universal health system that includes caring for our teeth and growing more secure jobs throughout our economy. Disability care is a significant reform towards a better and more equal society, and we Greens are proud to have backed from the beginning and have supported it through the parliament, and we congratulate the Gillard government for delivering. Achieving a more equitable schools funding model is also another important step for a fairer society, and the Australian Greens are right behind the Gonski school funding reforms. We've been advocating a fairer funding model for schools for over a decade, and we want it legislated before we rise for the election. The test will be whether the government's proposals live up to the expectations of the Gonski review for an equitable funding system. Australians have reason to be sceptical, given the very modest funding available in the next 4 years. For a Prime Minister who claims education to be the reason she entered parliament, she's selling the school children of Australia short, with only $473 million next year. More money should be flowing to our public schools, the schools that educate our most disadvantaged kids, and it should be flowing faster. The longer we wait, the more kids we're selling short. And the Coalition is all at sea on this issue. But to be perfectly clear, and from Mr Abbott's speech tonight, he has said he will not proceed without additional funding unless all the states sign up, and at this point many have not done so. The Greens will protect a fairer and more equitable funding model against a coalition government intent on letting our public schools down, and we will stand in the Senate and in the House of Representatives against any repeal. In contrast to schools, the budget actually cuts funding to childcare. It keeps in place the freeze on indexation on the childcare benefit rebate, leading to increased pressure on families struggling with the cost of living. When we know fees are increasing and the childcare sector desperately needs help to provide quality and flexible care for busy families, this is neither smart nor fair. The biggest disappointment for many Australians who are really struggling is the failure of the government to increase the rate of New Start and youth allowance and continuing to punish single parents. The paltry assistance of $19 a week to New Start recipients in terms of what they can earn, including single parents, puts a lie to Labor's claims of a fairer society. It's an insult to those who are struggling to make ends meet. And more than that, the decision to abolish the baby bonus by incorporating some of it into family tax benefit A will further hurt lower-income families. And whilst the Greens support in principle reform of the baby bonus, we want to ensure the poorest in our community are not hit harder by these changes. And it's disappointing that once again the opposition has joined with Labor to remove benefits from those most in need. And in Mr Abbott's speech tonight, he's gone even further. Not only is he going to cut New Start even further, he is going to delay the superannuation guarantee and take away the low-income tax rebate in super contributions, whilst at the same time letting the big miners off. The Gillard government failure to increase payments by $50 a week in regard to New Start, an increase supported by both business and the community sector, will lead to more people falling deeper into poverty. And it's even more disappointing that the government has decided not to act, despite the other players today voting to support a Greens motion noting that New Start is too low. This was the choice the government made, uncaring and mean. Uncaring and mean, like its race to the bottom with the coalition on who can be crueler to asylum seekers fleeing horrors in their own land. Lord Stern commented this week that with global warming the challenge of food security will see displacement of millions. In such a global context, Australia cannot continue its appalling treatment of refugees, and it was disgraceful to hear the Leader of the Opposition say that he is going to rescind the increased humanitarian intake. The government and the coalition's cruel policies are costing billions, nearly $10 billion from 2012 to the end of the Ford estimates, and undermining our international reputation. But more than that, it's just deliberately cruel policy. They're spending almost twice as much on cruel detention policies than on disability care and Gonski combined over the Ford estimates. What does that say about a fairer society? We also learned in the budget that the government is looking to revise Australia's refugee assessment processes to find new ways to punish refugees and shut people out from safety. This is the government now wanting to wind back humanitarian protections to deport more refugees back to the countries that they have fled from. It's not the policy of a nation that cares for people or seeks to play a leadership role in the Asian century. Adding insult to injury, we are now allocating overseas aid money to our cruel and inhumane refugee detention policies, in contradiction to the government's own scope of legitimate aid document, making us the third biggest recipient of our own overseas aid. Not fair, not smart, plain dumb and mean. And as well as demonstrating its lack of compassion here in Australia in the last 2 years, the government's cut $4.8 billion to overseas aid over the Ford estimates. Australia is in the right place at the right time for the very first time in our history. We're not only hosting the G20 next year, but we've been elected to the UN Security Council. But we're in danger of being perceived as uncaring by the rest of the world and on the international stage of making promises only then to break them. It should concern all Australians that while campaigning for the seat on the Security Council, Australia promised to meet our aid target of 0.5 in the timeframe agreed, and now we've reneged twice. What sort of country are we looking like? But population pressures are not only happening overseas, they're also at home. Some of the real pressures Australians are feeling come from living in cities with inadequate infrastructure. Now, we welcome the commitment to rail projects, in particular the Metro Rail and Perth Rail projects, but we're disappointed no funds were there for Hobart's light rail, and we're concerned about the apparent embrace by Labor of the failed public-private partnership model. And it's also disappointing that much of the good planning work on boosting public transport and active travel to create more sustainable and livable cities has not been converted into action. 70% of funding is still flowing to road projects. Investing in public transport and rail will relieve pressure on people in our cities, but the old parties are keeping up their obsession with roads. And the Coalition's speech tonight was just a classic. More highways everywhere. The government also failed to acknowledge the national housing crisis. The Labor Party and the Liberals have turned their back on millions of Australians struggling with unaffordable housing. Housing pressure is enormous here, yet the budget essentially ignored it, with no new programs for housing affordability, no new money for homelessness, no boost in public housing, no plans for more affordable rental or more affordable ownership, and no mention of the word housing at all in the budget speech. So much for fairer. Now, quality of life is further enhanced by the arts, and we welcome the fact that the cultural policy is now to be enacted, and we welcome the restructuring of the Australia Council. The Greens have been campaigning for a long time for increased resources to the ABC and SBS and are happy to have delivered a $129 million boost to the ABC and increase of $30 million for SBS. However, the failure to find a measly $1.4 million for community radio is a disgrace. The Greens will continue to do what we can to ensure additional support for community radio. Furthermore, regional arts have been ignored. In fact, the whole of regional Australia doesn't seem to exist for the Labor Party. Rural and regional Australia, which is facing very significant challenges, has been let down by the slashing of Caring for Our Country and the Biodiversity Fund, and taking away $2 billion from the Regional Infrastructure Fund will not make for a stronger economy or a fairer Australia. A stronger society is not just about money, but how we relate to each other, and the Greens are going to continue to boost that dividend of decency in Australia by pursuing marriage equality and by banning sports gambling advertising before 9 o'clock. Now, the Treasurer is reported to have yesterday placed Labor between the austerity freaks on the one hand and the Green types, who, according to him, want the bottom to fall out of the budget. Well, last year it was the Treasurer who was the austerity freak, insistent on a budget surplus this year, and it was the Greens showing economic maturity and responsibility calling for a delay in the surplus. And it is now we, the Green types, far from wanting the bottom to fall out of the budget, who've been identifying revenue measures, including fixing the mining tax, ending fossil fuel subsidies, introducing a levy on the big banks. And it's the Treasurer who would rather engage in stereotyping than stepping up or standing up to Rio Tinto, BHP, Xstrata or the big banks. The Labor government had the opportunity with this budget to manage the economy in a way that would care for people and protect our environment. That would have been smart and fair. Instead, we got $2.3 billion of university cuts, $1 billion taken from clean energy and the environment, and continued punishment for single parents and the unemployed. I don't think they will take much comfort from a 10-year roadmap with a shelf life, if the polls are right, of only a few months. And Tony Abbott will be worse if his speech tonight is anything to go by, and that's why you need the Greens. It's governments working with the Greens that deliver major reforms. It is the Greens who have delivered the clean energy package. It's the Greens who have delivered Denticare. And it will be the Greens who will deliver marriage equality. And what's more, we will stand up strong in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and we will not repeal the legislation that has been so hard fought, particularly for schools, particularly for clean energy, and we will stand against the excesses of any future government, including an Abbott government, who tries to turn it back. The Australian Greens will deliver a caring Australia, a path to a safe climate and a proud global reputation. We are the competent, adult, honest party who will stand up to those who protect their own interests to the detriment of the environment and deny everyone else a fair go. It's the Greens who will stand up with a strong voice for what is right and what is genuinely strong, smart and fair in caring for people and protecting